Hello, everyone, and welcome to the State Department. My name's Macon Phillips. I'm Director of Digital Strategy at the White House. And many of you just finished seeing the President's speech about the Middle East and North Africa. Throughout the speech, prior to the speech, people have been on Twitter using the #MeSpeech hashtag to talk about the President's speech, react, and ask questions. In fact, we were seeing that the hashtag was trending worldwide, which makes it even more exciting that we're about to start this new type of event. I'm joined today by Mark Lynch from foreignpolicy.com and Andy Carvin from NPR, who have been glued to their screens, seeing what people are saying, and will be throughout this conversation with Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes to talk about your reactions, get your questions about what the President just covered in his speech. So with that, I'll hand it over to Andy. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us. Ben, I was hoping we could start with just some general concepts, the themes that emerged on Twitter both before and afterwards. When we first started asking people to submit questions, we heard from several people who said they didn't even think it was worth time. So for example, someone named An Mustafa, who's from Sudan, he said, "I don't think the people here are waiting to ask questions. They've given up on the US government." So does the administration think it can actually have a positive impact when so many people in the region simply don't trust it anymore?
Well, first of all, thanks for doing this, guys. What I'd say, Andy, is the President spoke about this in Cairo, which is that there's a lot of mistrust in the region that has built up over many years. There's a mistrust of the United States and our policies. And as the President said today, there's a mistrust in the United States about the future of a region where there's been so much conflict in recent years. But I think the clear point that the President made today is that the President and the United States of America embraces the change that is taking place in the region. And that we, at this moment of opportunity, a moment when people are reaching peacefully for their universal rights, that we can realign our policies to advance the universal rights of the people of the region, their political rights as well as their economic prosperity, as well as their peace and security. And clearly the United States has an important role to play, given our history in the region, given our relationships, given our world leadership. So the role of the United States is entirely relevant to the change that's taking place in the region. We're not going to be able to dictate that change, as he said today. The people of the region are going to do it themselves. But what we can do is use the different levers of American power to support peaceful democratic change and prosperity.
A number of people on Twitter brought up this notion of a double standard. So for example, Hisham_G from Morocco, he's asked, why is the U.S. stuck in its double standard approach with regard to Arab regimes? A Libyan man named Tasnim Q asks this variation of interest versus values. I've seen lots of questions of those. One big example that keeps coming up again and again is Bahrain. One person on Twitter, Nasser Wadadi, who's from Mauritania, but he lives in the U.S., said, I hope to hear two words, Bahrain and sanctions. Well, now that we've heard the speech, we've heard the word Bahrain, but we didn't hear that word sanctions. Meanwhile, another person on Twitter, Alpha Leia, she said, please, for the love of God, ask about torture and human rights abuses in Bahrain. What actions, if any, will the U.S. take? So I guess my question for you then is, why hasn't the U.S. taken a more active approach to dealing with Bahrain and the repression that's been taking place there?
Well, I'd say a few things, because there are a few questions embedded in that, obviously. First of all, the President has spoken about universal rights. Those are rights that apply to people in all countries, whether those are countries that are traditionally hostile to the United States or whether those are traditional partners. And I would say that from the beginning of these protests 6 months ago, the United States has spoken out for the rights of people in places like Egypt, where we were very aggressive, again, in speaking out against any repression and supporting a transition that had President Mubarak leave power. So in the first instance, I think that we have been consistent in advocating rights across different borders, whether they're friend or foe. With regard to Bahrain, I think the President, not only did he address it, but he even framed it in the way that your questioners did. He said in his speech that to be credible, the United States has to speak up for rights within the borders of countries that the United States is friends with, as well as countries like Syria that we've been had, of course, a very difficult relationship with. So with regard to Bahrain, I think you heard him in his speech say that we obviously strongly oppose any torture, any false imprisonment, any use of brute force. And what we've been focused on in Bahrain from the beginning of the protests is, again, making it clear publicly and privately to the Bahraini government that force and military action is not going to be the resolution to the challenges in Bahrain, that it won't bring stability, frankly, that there are legitimate grievances, as the President said today, that the Bahraini people have. And what the United States is doing is supporting a process of peaceful negotiation that has obviously not yet gotten underway. But what we've done is work very aggressively with the government of Bahrain, and frankly, we speak to the opposition as well, to encourage a political settlement and a political resolution to the challenges there, and one that's responsive to the people as well. So I think he spoke about Bahrain and will continue to do so in the days ahead.
But do you think talk will be enough to push Bahrain into working with the opposition and letting them out of jail for negotiations? Because, yes, we've heard the President say this a number of times, but yet it doesn't seem like much has changed as far as the Bahrain regime is concerned so far.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, our message to the government of Bahrain is it's in their interest to pursue those talks. It's in their interest to respond to the aspirations of their people. That the model of stability through brute force doesn't work anymore. And that's something that the President said very clearly in his speech today as well. So in the first instance, we believe it's in the interest of the Bahraini government and the Bahraini people for there to be a political process, a process of negotiation, and a process that's responsive to the people of Bahrain. And similarly, that process can go forward if you're imprisoning members of the opposition. Now, as in every country in the region, the United States can't dictate an outcome. We can't get every leader to do exactly what we'd like. What we can do is use our diplomacy, use our influence to press for what we believe in. And what we believe in is a process that respects the rights of the Bahraini people.
Ben, Nasser Wadadi, the Mauritanian activist, he wanted to follow up by asking, how can there be a dialogue in Bahrain when the opposition is in jail facing death sentences?
The President said essentially the same words in his speech, which is that you cannot have a dialogue when the opposition or members of the opposition are imprisoned, and imprisoned falsely. So we are strongly urging publicly and privately for the release of political prisoners, and for serious commitment by the Bahraini government to demonstrate that it is a credible partner for a dialogue.
Now, Wadadi, in his original question, said, will there be sanctions attached to that? What if public and private assurances don't work?
Mm-hmm. Look, again, right now what we're focused on is using our contacts, using our communication with the government and with the opposition as well to encourage a political settlement. And we believe that the best role the United States can play in Bahrain is to take advantage of those relationships. That's, for instance, been useful to us in Egypt when, in the early days of those protests, because of the depth of the relationships we had in Egypt, we were able to communicate with the government and the military at many levels to express our strong condemnation and displeasure with any crackdown on the Egyptian people. So we think the best way for us to exert our influence in Bahrain right now is through aggressively working those contacts and pushing publicly, as the President did today, and privately for a negotiated settlement.
All right, thanks. We want to move to another topic, which is something which has been all over Twitter, and a major part of Twitter, and which was touched on in the speech in some ways, but not in others, and that's the question of how the administration thinks about Palestinian protest movements and the like. And so the question that I'm retweeting is from an academic based in Lebanon, and it's very blunt. He says, when Israel kills demonstrators, is that the same as when Syria or Libya does the same?
Look, of course, whenever somebody is killed who is exercising their peaceful rights, it's something that the United States opposes, wherever it is. So again, that's a uniform policy of the United States, that we don't believe force should be used against peaceful protesters and civilians, whether they're in the Palestinian territories, whether they're in Bahrain, or whether they're in Damascus, and whether they're in Tehran. In terms of what we're doing in general, you heard the President again reaffirm a commitment to a Palestinian state, which is the basis on which Palestinians will have true security, and again, take that extra step, a historic step for an American president, to make it clear that the basis for negotiations in pursuit of that outcome should be the 1967 lines with swaps.
Well, let me follow up on that a little bit. One of the questions that we had was, will the administration accept the results of the upcoming Palestinian elections no matter who the winner is? With the implication being, what we heard in the speech was that you were going to wait and see how they behaved. Is that in fact the case?
Well, I think I'd say a couple things. First of all, it's what he said in the speech, the president, is that Israel can't make peace with a partner that doesn't recognize its right to exist. It's simply a matter of common sense as well as security. So we continue to believe that Hamas needs to renounce terrorism and recognize Israel's right to exist, to be a credible partner. And again, I think in general, as a more general matter across the region, with regard to elections, what you heard the president say is that he welcomes all peaceful movements, even those we disagree with, but that ultimately the judgment will be based on their behavior, whether they respect the rights of minorities, whether they are nonviolent. So those are the characteristics that we look for across the region, because frankly, we don't want to see elections be used, as the president said in the speech, to govern without consent, but rather through coercion. We want to see elections lead to governments that are representative of the people and that act in a peaceful manner.
Let me move then to a question about the speech itself. Rahul Breddy asks, is there any significance to Obama's emphasis about Israel, quote, defending itself?
Well, the significance is what the president said, which is that any nation needs to have the ability to defend itself. So that would be similarly a principle that applies to all nations. Now, in the specific reference that the president made, he was talking about principles around a peace agreement. And we know that two of the issues that have long been the subject of negotiations are the nature of Palestinian borders, the territory of the Palestinian state, and Israel's security concerns. And so the two steps the president took today is making clear where the United States believes those negotiations should lead. So obviously with regard to Palestine, as I said, it'd be 1967 borders with swaps. And with regard to Israel, that there'll have to be, on Israel's standpoint, an assurance that it can defend itself, that it's secure, and that an outcome of a peace settlement wouldn't be hostile to its people.
All right, let me ask one last question and then turn it back over to Andy. And this is on a different topic. We had 3 or 4 different versions of the same question, which was disappointment at no mention of Saudi Arabia, even where there was an appreciation of a critique of Bahrain. And could you speak to the absence of Saudi Arabia from the speech?
Sure. I think with regard to specific countries in the speech, what the president did is he spoke in some level of detail about countries where change has been particularly contested, where there have been violence in the streets or where there have been transitions. So he spoke of Egypt and Tunisia as being at the vanguard of this movement in terms of entering their democratic transitions. He spoke about Syria, Bahrain, Yemen, Libya, all places again that have really been on the front burner of this period of change, and where change has been contested. With regard to Saudi Arabia, I think what we've done in the past and will continue to do in the future is raise these issues associated with human rights and reform in the kingdom, even as we, of course, have a long-standing partnership with them.
Do you agree with the sentiment which is prevalent on Twitter that Saudi Arabia does not agree with the American vision for change in the region?
I think that I couldn't, personally characterize their view. What I can say is the president is not simply stating the American position, which is that there needs to be this process of democratic reform and broader rights in the region. But he's also saying, as a matter of fact, that stability is not going to come from the old ways of doing things. That stability is going to come from this process of respect for rights and a process of reform. Because the world has changed. The world has changed because of communications. The world has changed because of people's ability to connect with one another and to organize. And the world has changed because of these protests. So frankly, our message to every government in the region is, for those who have an interest in stability, stability is not going to come through the status quo. Stability is going to have to come through this process of change.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah, let me just finish this typing here.
This is hard.
Yes, it is, but we're keeping up
Fire
so
away.
far. All right, so we want to switch topics for just a moment and talk a little bit about Egypt. I received a tweet last night from Nora Shalaby in Cairo. Nora's brother actually was on trial today. He was one of the many protesters that were arrested several days ago in front of the Israeli embassy. In his particular case, he was lucky. He was found not guilty, but others probably won't find that same fate. And so Nora's question is, if the U.S. is trying to be supportive of Egypt, why are they tolerating the army detaining peaceful protesters and trying them militarily?
Well, I'm not familiar with the specifics of the case. What I will say is that at every juncture, our communication to the Egyptian military and the Egyptian government has underscored the importance of respecting the rights of its people, including the right of peaceful protest. And again, as I said, this was something we were communicating on a daily basis, more than daily, hourly basis, at some points through the height of the protests before President Mubarak stepped aside. And it's certainly something we'll continue to communicate. And I think, the President said there's great hope in Egypt, but there's also things to be concerned about. The sectarian violence that's taken place in Egypt is, I know, of great concern to many Egyptians. And it's a concern to us, too, which is why the President went out of his way to speak about the Coptic Christians and their right to worship. So that will continue to be our posture going forward, that we want to see positive change, one that, again, respects these basic rights, including the right to protest, and one that, again, leads to an inclusive Egypt. And frankly, I think that's where the majority of the Egyptian people are, as they've been very concerned, as I said, about both the sectarian violence and any threat to their democratic revolution.
But what specifically about military trials? For a lot of people, whether they participated in the revolution or they're outside observers, it does seem a little strange, if not quite hypocritical, that after all the effort they made to conduct this revolution, they find these same protesters being put on trial militarily, which frankly might not be that different from what might have happened under Mubarak.
Yeah. Well, I'd just say a couple of things. First of all, we have a strong commitment to the equal administration of justice and confidence in the rule of law. And we've been pressing on these issues in Egypt since before the protests, with our opposition to the emergency law and other measures. So we'd obviously like to see a system that is respectful of the rule of law and it has a process that the people can have confidence in. Our hope and expectation and what we'll work for over time is as Egypt continues down its democratic path, as there is an election and then a democratically elected government in Egypt, that it governs with respect for the rights of its citizens and respect for the equal administration of justice.
I've got one last question for you regarding Egypt, and this is from a Twitter user who goes by the name of Dualism. His real name is Adel Abdul Ghaffar. And his question is, will the U.S. support upcoming election results regardless of who wins?
Yes, absolutely. And again, you saw the president say very clearly in his speech today that we respect the right of everybody to participate in the political process, including people that we've had strong disagreements with in the past. And that therefore, we will embrace relations with inclusive and democratic governments. Again, provided that those governments do continue to respect the rights of their people and they don't repress minority rights and they don't stand in the way of the type of democratic change that the Egyptian people would like to see. And I'd just say one other thing, just because you said you're moving off Egypt. One of the things that we try to do in the speech is lay out a very strong program of economic support for Egypt, because we believe, we've heard from Egyptians that that's something that is very important to them, and that to reinforce their democratic transition, they need to have greater economic opportunity for their people. So we are very focused on steps we can take through debt relief, through assistance, through trade relations, that can expand prosperity in a way that reinforces democratic change.
You mentioned that you hear from Egyptians themselves that economic change is what they want. And over the last few days, there's been a controversy, a Twitter controversy about Wael Ghanem, who the president mentioned obliquely in the speech. And Wael Ghanem said basically that the revolution should focus on economic growth and economic development and set aside protesting for a while. And it set off quite a storm in the Egyptian blogosphere. And I guess the question is, do you think that that Egyptians will be receptive to that message, given their response to Wael?
Well, what we think is that the two are mutually reinforcing. That from the very beginning, people protest because of a lack of political rights. People protest because of a lack of economic opportunity. And those things are interrelated, because part of the reason that people don't have opportunity is it's concentrated in the hands of the few. There's been great corruption in Egypt. So in the first instance, the protests were driven by both political and economic concerns. Similarly, the transition needs to be reinforced by both political change and economic change. We studied democratic transitions as we were preparing the speech. And one of the things that we saw is that nations that are able to grow economically and provide more opportunities for their people are more likely to consolidate democratic growth. Eastern European nations after 1989, nations like Indonesia and others in Latin America. So we believe that the two very much go hand in hand, and frankly, you shouldn't focus on one to the exclusion of the other. You can't just focus on the political evolution of a country and ignore the great need for opportunity for the people. Similarly, you can't just focus on economic issues and not reinforce the message the president had today, which is that we want to see a democratic transition in Egypt with credible and accountable institutions.
Great. Can we switch now briefly to a couple of other countries? A number of questions about the real meaning of the tougher rhetoric on Syria. And so I guess to sum up 5 or 6 different tweets, suppose that Assad does not take the opportunity and reform. What follows from that?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, the president laid that out in his speech when he said if he does not take that opportunity, he will continue to lose the confidence of his people and he'll continue to be isolated abroad. Essentially, we have ratcheted up the pressure on Assad. We've imposed sanctions on him personally and those around him. And the steps that they would need to take in order to demonstrate, as the president said, a commitment to democratic reform are clear: releasing political prisoners, stop brutalizing people, allow human rights monitors, and start a meaningful and serious change towards democracy in Syria. So those are the steps, and if he doesn't take them, we'll be continuing to ratchet up the pressure internationally with our allies and partners. And clearly the Syrian people will lose confidence, because what we've seen is as they've pursued this path of crackdown, he's lost increasingly the support of his people. And so he's going to lose the confidence increasingly of the Syrian people, who are going to be the ones who are going to determine the outcome of this, of Syria's future.
Would, if the violence in Syria escalates, would the United States be willing to do in Syria what it did in Libya?
Well, I think that you can't, one of the things we've seen, and it's important to keep in mind, is you can't expect that the exact same tools are going to apply in different countries. In Libya, it was a very specific circumstance where we knew that there was an imminent massacre. There was literally an armed force advancing on a city, Benghazi, had a siege on a city, Misrata, and was advancing on a number of other population centers. We had a call from the Libyan people for intervention. We had an international coalition ready to act. And by taking action at the time that we did, we were able to stop that in its tracks and save thousands of lives and create some space for the Libyan people to organize. That doesn't mean we're going to be able to replicate those unique circumstances in every other country. So in Syria, what we're focused on right now is bringing all the tools to bear that we can to pressure the Assad regime, to amplify those tools by working with partners, and by continuing to make clear the types of things that we expect the Assad regime to do if it's going to be responsive to its people.
Okay, great. Let me ask one more before I turn it back over to Andy, which is then how does that apply in Yemen? Why are we currently seeing sanctions on Syria but not on Saleh's government?
Well, I think again in each country you make a calculation about what can have the best impact, and we believe that sanctions were important to send a signal to the Syrian regime that we're going to be ratcheting it up, and that sanctions themselves could have a bite on the Syrian government. In Yemen, and the President reiterated it today in his speech, we've been very clear that we think they're in speed of transition, that it needs to begin. President Saleh had said that he would step aside for the sake of his people, and he hasn't done that yet. So we've been supportive of that transition beginning. We've been supportive of the GCC initiative. We're very disappointed that President Saleh has not yet followed through on his own commitment. And we're communicating that very clearly directly to him. John Brennan spoke to him yesterday to deliver that message. So we believe, again, that the outline is in place in Yemen for a transition. And what we're focusing our effort on with the GCC as well is getting President Saleh to follow through on his own commitment.
Do you believe that drone strikes in Yemen make this easier or harder to bring about this transition?
Well, I think with respect to our counterterrorism efforts in Yemen, I frankly think that's something that we pursued with the Yemeni government. We pursue going forward. We have relationships that go beyond one man in Yemen, and it doesn't affect our calculus that President Saleh needs to respond to his people's calls for change. It doesn't affect the fact that we think he needs to make good on his own commitment, which was to step aside as a part of a transition. So again, we are confident that our counterterrorism efforts can continue, and frankly, we believe that they'll be strengthened if Yemen is more stable because of a transition. This gets to the point I've made several times, which is that we don't believe that the status quo is somehow working for anybody. It's not working for the United States. It's not working for the people of the region, and it's not going to work for those who want stability in the region as well. So, frankly, we would all benefit from a process of change and reform in Yemen that is responsive to the people, because Yemen then would be not just a more democratic place, but frankly, a more stable place.
Thanks. Andy?
Yeah, at this point, I want to switch over to Libya. Let me just send out this tweet. So the first question from Libya, for Libya, comes from a person on Twitter who goes by the name Tripolitanian. He's Libyan and has been tweeting since the very beginning of the protests. And Tripolitanian's question is, what will it take for the U.S. to formally recognize the National Transitional Council, or the NTC, as the sole representative of the Libyan people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've taken a number of steps already to build our relationship with the Council. We have an envoy in Benghazi. We believe it's a credible and legitimate interlocutor. Secretary Clinton has met several times with their representatives. Tom Donilon, the National Security Advisor, met with them in the White House the other day. We're providing assistance directly to the Libyan people and to the Council. So we've taken a range of measures to have very strong ties to the Council, and we again see it as a legitimate and a credible representative of the Libyan people. Formal diplomatic recognition is an issue we're working through, and that has to do with a number of legal questions associated with it. But in terms of our actions and our relationship, it's very strong with the opposition. We have the ability, again, to have diplomatic ties with them, to provide assistance to them. So we're very confident that we have a deepening relationship with the Council, and we're going to continue to pursue that relationship.
Is there any more you can say about some of those legal hurdles that need to be dealt with? In other words, is this essentially, it's going to happen when it happens, and it's only legal issues that are blocking it now? Is it our intention to recognize them as soon as those legal hurdles are dealt with?
Well, I'd say two things. One, I'm no expert on those particular issues, but I do think that the actions of the United States send a message, and recognizing them as a credible representative and legitimate representative of the Libyan people, doing the things I spoke about with assistance and diplomatic ties, sends essentially a message that we're engaging with them as a representative of Libyans. In terms of the exact timeline for additional steps, part of that depends on events in Libya and whether we can hasten the exit of Gaddafi through our efforts and what type of transition emerges from that. So it's something we're looking at, but again, we believe that we're quite confident in our relationship with the Council, and I think the Council has appreciated the support and assistance of the United States.
So are you saying here that recognition of the National Transitional Council would not occur before Gaddafi leaving or surrendering?
I'm not ruling it out. I'm not saying it's going to happen either. What we've been focused on is, again, building that relationship with the council, doing all the things that we would normally do with an interlocutor in another country, providing, frankly, a substantial amount of support to the Libyan people, both through our military action, our support for the coalition, and our direct assistance. But we'll continue to work this particular issue as we go forward.
I've got a couple of quick ones here. This is essentially a follow-up question from Mariam Adarat, who is Libyan. She goes by the name Mustafa 78. She wants to know how the U.S. exactly will expand its role in Libya to deliver what she calls the final blow to the Gaddafi regime.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we've done a number of things. We, the United States, provided a lot of the military effort on the front end to stop the Gaddafi regime in its tracks and to substantially degrade his forces. We continue to provide a range of support to the military effort in Libya, and we, as I said, continue to provide assistance and diplomatic support to the Council. I think our judgment is that time is not working against Gaddafi, that he is losing control over greater portions of his country, that people in his regime and people around him are making the decision to leave, that he has no credible path to regaining the kind of power he had before this intervention. So we're essentially tightening the squeeze. And you've seen some progress in Benghazi, Najibiyah. You've seen progress in Misrata in recent days. We've, again, continued to degrade his forces. And the other measures we put in place, the arms embargo, the sanctions, cut him off from the ability to essentially resupply himself. So he's running out of options. And again, we think that over time, the opposition is going to get stronger because they have space to operate, they're getting assistance, while Gaddafi is not going to be able to get stronger because his forces are being degraded and he's cut off from the materials he needs. So we're quite confident that we can work on an international basis to, again, make it clear to Gaddafi that the best option for him and the best option for Libya is for him to go.
So here's one on a different topic. And it's actually going back to an older topic. The question that I've seen a number of times now is why Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian issue was included to the extent that it was in a speech about the Arab Spring, and if you could draw out the connections that the president sees between them.
Yeah. Well, he spoke a little bit about this specifically, which is that at a time when the region has an enormous opportunity to move forward and to leave behind a painful past and to make sure that people have their rights respected and have a better future. This conflict has been a source of great pain and difficulty in the region. Obviously, most of all for Israelis and Palestinians, but it's also stood in the way of the type of bridges that could be built among people. It's stood in the way of deeper ties across the region. It's been used as a distraction, frankly, in countries where leaders have used it to distract people from their own shortcomings and their own repressive governance. So we believe that at a time when we're looking to the type of future that we want to see in the Arab world and in the region, that the resolution of this conflict would unlock a lot of potential. Obviously, it would provide self-determination for the Palestinians, security and self-determination for the Israelis, but it would also remove this major irritant and major source of tension and frankly, despair in the region in a way that, again, could be very powerful in unlocking the promise of the Middle East.
Great, thanks. On a totally different topic, how does the White House avoid another Iraq disaster by picking and choosing which revolutionaries to back?
Well, I don't think we're picking and choosing revolutionaries. We're standing up for rights. And I think that's what's important about our message is, it's not we're not going to dictate this outcome. The United States is not going to say this person is going to lead this country with precision. What we are going to say is that the people of the region deserve the right to choose their own leaders, and they deserve the right to dictate these outcomes. And so where we've intervened very aggressively in Libya, for instance, it wasn't on the behalf of any one political actor. It was on behalf of stopping a massacre of people, stopping a massacre that would not only lead to thousands of lives, but would make it impossible for the type of democratic change that people are calling for in protests to be met. So we don't see this as picking future leaders, picking revolutionaries. We see it as standing up for rights. And we also don't see it similar to Iraq because we're not sending an invasion force. We're not occupying a country. We're not militarily undertaking regime change because we believe that the regime change that does take place in the region needs to be owned by the people of the region, not the United States.
Another question from the West Bank. Will the U.S. veto a UN resolution declaring Palestinian state?
Look, we have not seen that particular resolution, but I think the president did say he didn't think actions at the United Nations in September would result in an independent Palestinian state. Because frankly, at the end of the day, Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to work out these issues, are going to have to live together, are going to have to achieve peace. So we just don't think that the venue for the achievement of Palestinian statehood is United Nations. We do think, however, that Palestinians obviously are entitled to deserve a state of their own. And we took the extra step today of defining the nature of how the United States believes that state should be, which is 67 lines with swaps.
So I think we'd like to end this with one last question, and this comes from Arsalan Iftikhar. And he asks, with Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric as major political wedge issues, can we expect President Obama to visit an American mosque in the near future to reach out to the American Muslim community?
Well, obviously the president has made a lot of efforts to reach out to the Muslim community here in the United States and around the world. Visiting a mosque is certainly something I'm sure he'd be interested in doing. We don't have anything on the schedule, but it's a type of thing that he would certainly do as a part of that broader outreach. I will say, just to conclude, since you said we're wrapping up, and this goes back to the first question. We understand that there's a great deal of, again, as I said, mistrust, frustration sometimes. You hear that in the feedback at times in the region. But what we're signaling in this speech, just as we did in the Cairo speech, is that we're interested in pursuing a new type of partnership in the region, and one that goes beyond simply governments that we've been partners with, but goes to the people of the region. And the United States can bring a lot to bear to support universal rights. We can use our relationships with governments. We can use tools like sanctions where we believe they'll make a difference. We can use our economic assistance to empower positive models. We can speak out and use our voice. We can provide direct assistance, as the president said, to civil society and to groups who are advocating for the type of future that we'd like to see. So what I leave people with who've been watching and tweeting is that we want to pursue the type of partnership that, again, turns the page on a very difficult period in the past and is responsive to those rights and aspirations that people across the region are reaching for. Again, I think that we know that all the problems in the region won't be solved overnight. We know that all the mistrust that's built up over time is not going to disappear overnight. But the president is laying out a marker, and he's saying we embrace this change. That's not easy for the United States to do in some instances. We've already made difficult decisions, for instance, with regard to Egypt, when we essentially broke from the Mubarak government and embraced the protests there. But we believe that because of who we are, who the United States is, and our foundational commitment to democracy and individual rights, that we have an interest in the people who are protesting peacefully in the streets succeeding over time. So that's the future that we want, and we'll keep communicating that through our actions as well as our words. And I know people always judge the follow-through, but I think you'll see, and have already seen, but will continue to see, a serious follow-through. As the president said, this is not a secondary interest to us. This is a top priority. It's a top national interest in the region right now to promote this type of democratic and economic change that is responsive to people. So that's the core message.
So just to follow up very quickly on that, you said we were trying to turn the page with countries overseas, but again, going back to the question of the administration's relationship with Muslim Americans, do you think it's possible, or will President Obama visit a mosque at some point in the future?
It's certainly, yeah, absolutely. It's something it's certainly he would do. I have to say we we have really made the point of underscoring too, in the United States, the contributions of American Muslims. He's, of course, hosted a couple of iftars with the American Muslim community, and we've frankly held that up as the ultimate rebuke to those who say the United States and Islam are incompatible. They can't be incompatible when you have a thriving Muslim American community here in the United States, one that has contributed, frankly, directly to this administration, a number of Muslim Americans serving in very important positions, but obviously contributed to the life of our nation. So that's the Muslim American community is the foundation, I think, of our point, which is that the United States and Islam are overlapping and reinforcing, and they're not at odds with one another.
I have one last question, since you were talking about follow-through. One question that we saw on Twitter a number of times was the question of follow-through on the dialogue itself. And so this has been a really, I think, interesting and I think innovative event. But people wanted to know, well, then what follows from that? Mm-hmm. Is there a way to maintain ongoing dialogue with the administration, with the United States, and to have their voices heard?
Yeah, I'd say a number of things about that. First of all, associated with this speech, one of the things we've been working on is since Cairo, we've been trying to expand the people we engage with in the region. We've talked about this. So it's not just governments, and it's not just the traditional civil society actors, but it's education exchanges, it's entrepreneurship networks, it's reaching out to young people, it's reaching out to science and technological cooperation. And we've done a lot of that. We need to do better, though. And one of the things that we want to do going forward is signal in our engagement that we're reaching beyond elites, as the president said. We're reaching beyond capitals. We want to open the doors of our embassies and consulates. We want to increase the type of civil society actors that we're engaging with. We want to use technology, frankly, as the president said, to listen to people directly, to get this type of feedback, even if it's things that are uncomfortable for us to hear at times. We want to leverage technology to hear directly from people. So that's a directive, frankly, that we're giving to the government to broaden that circle of engagement, to reach more people, and to make sure we're using the tools that are clearly connecting people across the region so that they can talk directly to us and that we can communicate directly to them. So we want that to be one of the key takeaways, frankly, of this speech, that we want to enlarge the circles and networks of people that we are talking to across the Middle East and North Africa.
All right, thanks, Ben. I think I'm going to go,
Yeah,
I think
soak my fingers in ice now.
Yeah, I think that's time for us to rest our fingers.
Yeah.
And Ben, thanks for taking
no
the time
problem.
to join us.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Ben.